Hi, my name is Todd Leonard,
And my name is Herb Montgomery.
and we're just talking.
And before we begin, please take a moment and like or subscribe there on your screen. That helps us a lot.
And if you'd like to be notified about when a new show drops, which we plan to do that on Fridays, please click the bell icon.
And each week, what we're going to be doing is talking about the gospel lectionary reading for the upcoming weekend.
And we're going to talk about that passage in the context of love, inclusion, and societal justice. And our hope is that our talking will be just talking. So today we're in the Gospel of Matthew and verses 21 through 37, which has a number of kind of topics to cover in the areas of what Jesus has to say about anger and about adultery and lust and about oath making. So Herb, where do you want to start?
Well, as I was sharing with you earlier this week, out of all the passages for us to start this show with, this is probably not the most like favorite passage we could talk about, but we were starting this week, and that's what's in the lectionary. The one thing that jumps out to me first in this passage is just the reality that we're getting a window into the concerns of the early Jesus movement, with the language of raka and calling your brother or sister fool. These are in-house kind of how you treat your fellow Jesus follower concerns. But again, we're getting a window into kind of what the possible original audience was for which this gospel was written and what they would have been concerned about. There's going to be a little bit of distance between us and them. I don't think anybody goes around. I mean, I've never gotten mad at you, Todd, and called you Raka.
Yeah, it's a little cultural variation from the things that I've called you in the past, and but you're right. I mean, I think this is, and again, we're also dealing with the whole issue of where you've got what Jesus probably most likely said versus what may have been added into what he was saying, as Matthew is thinking specifically about what he wants to tell his audience. And so
right,
dealing with those issues and about, what is the most historical accurate thing that Jesus said versus what is Matthew adding in, there's a lot that can be debated, and it may not be ultimately, some of those nuanced points may not be that important, but in other ways, understanding the cultural differences does impact how we read them, especially today, I think. And I think we'll discover that as we're moving through this section.
Yeah, I agree. Whether we debate, whether something's historical or whether it's the author's viewpoint here. This is the author of Matthew's Gospel's version of the Sermon on the Mount. You know what I mean? And definitely that author is writing with a certain audience in mind. And I think we can at least agree that this is stuff that would have resonated with the original audience.
Right.
We can
That's
argue
true.
over whether Jesus actually said these things or not.
Right.
But this is at least something that the author of Matthew thought, well, this is relevant to what these communities are going through.
That's right.
So the first thing that jumps out to me too is the big one is right at the end of that first section, where it says, anyone who says you fool will be in danger of the fire of hell. And man, I grew up in the South, and that just brings back all kinds of neat Bible Belt memories.
Yeah.
I mean, we usually think of Jesus as the guy that's loving and kind and merciful and inclusive. And now he's saying, if you call someone a fool, you're going to go to hell.
And I think
it's a rough start.
It is a rough start because it's just, yeah, it's, let's be frank, it's a bit kind of overkill. Um, it's I
Yeah,
just, I don't even know how to, what to say about it other than really.
right.
It's
Well, something that helps me with this passage, and I don't know how many people out there have actually wrestled with this, but something that helps me with this passage is when I discovered that the Christian lens of a postmortem, eternal torment, hell, whatever you want to call that, that's a rather late addition to passages like this. That the Greek word here actually that Jesus is referring to is or using is Gehenna, and I wrote about this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here on it, but I wrote about it this week on our blog at renewedheartministries.com, and it's in the Jesus for Everyone podcast. There's reference if you want the references for what I'm about to say. If what I'm about to say is kind of a new thought and you're like, wait a second, then I want to encourage you to go to Renewed Heart Ministries and look up the article this week, Rewriting the Sermon on the Mount. But the language here for Gehenna has a long history, and Todd, you know this, but it starts off with King Ahaz sacrificing children to Moloch in the valley of the son of Hinnom. And then we get all the way down to Jeremiah, and Jeremiah says this will no longer be called Topheth or the valley of the son of Hinnom, where these evil things have happened. This is going to be called the valley of slaughter, and that's in Jeremiah 29 through chapter 33, somewhere around in there. But again, the references are in the article. And what Jeremiah is referring to is Gehenna. That was the threat there in Jeremiah, and the Hebrew prophetic tradition was of the covenant people being overtaken by Babylon, by this foreign Gentile empire, that this is what's going to happen to you if you continue moving in this direction. First of all, there's a lot of things that help me in this, is that first of all, in Jeremiah's use of Gehenna, it was in this life, something you'd experience in this life, not the next.
right.
Number two, it was temporal. It wasn't eternal. It had an end point, a terminal point, and there was the promise of this being turned around one day. And so I would much rather read this through that lens, saying that Jesus, being the Jewish man that he is, and standing in the Hebrew prophetic tradition that he's characterized by in the Jesus story, he's speaking in true Jewish male first century fashion, saying, listen, if you guys continue doing this, you're going to be in danger if you keep practicing. And he's repeating the prophets. If you keep practicing injustice in this way, you're going to suffer the same thing that the prophets said you would suffer. And he's speaking through a Jewish lens. So it helps me to read this through, again, that Jewish wisdom lens, rather than the Christian postmortem hell. I think that's a later addition. I don't see Jesus talking about hell.
No, not at all. I think you're exactly right. When you're looking also at, sometimes in this whole Sermon on the Mount narrative, you have Jesus kind of going to the root causes of things, going to well, where does stuff like slaughter in the valley of Gehenna end up taking? How does that stuff end up coming about? It's because there's been all these steps along the way where people have not resolved their anger and have chosen, rather than responding to things in trying to solve the anger, allowing the anger to grow and become more and more violent, which ends up resulting in these things like wars and slaughters that take place again and again throughout all history. And so I think when he's saying you start out name calling and using insults and seeking to indignify the people next to you, you're going down that road. You are headed down that same road.
You're on a path, and this is where that path ends.
That's right. And it's no good for anybody. So stop before you get there. Put on the brakes, hold back, turn and hold those words in, and deal with the anger that you've got in your heart before it turns into much more violent manifestations.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. And again, I just want to reemphasize this too. If you're out there watching this and you're intrigued by the teachings of Jesus, like some of the things that are in common with other faiths too, like the golden rule or enemy love or inclusion, some of those types of teachings, and yet you bump into a passage like this where Jesus is threatening you with hell. If that's a disconnect for you, you're not alone. You're not alone.
Right.
There's lots of us who really resonate with the Jesus we see in the Jesus story, but we don't subscribe to this other stuff, and we don't think Jesus taught it either. So again,
Right.
if you like Jesus, but this is kind of a hitch for you, or a catch where you're like, not that's not cool. You're right, it's not cool.
Right.
The way it's traditionally explained, we don't subscribe to that either.
Well, and the irony is, if you read it in the traditional way that Christians have always read it, you've actually, while Jesus is condemning people for getting angry and turning their anger into violence, we're putting on God that exact same behavior and saying that, but God gets to engage in this ultimate form of, right? He's the angriest of all, and he's going to slaughter everybody. Right. So right. that whole, it just doesn't fit if we're going to look at it in that context. We have to look at it, as Herbie so perfectly put it, that it's coming from the prophetic tradition of Judaism.
I'm going to download the transcript after this because you've think perfect.
We just froze up there for a minute. We may need to try to. Are you back, Herb?
Yeah, sorry, my internet. I live in Appalachia, and our internet is not always the best here. Sorry.
That's okay. Just we're just glad you're back. We're glad you didn't get consumed by the fires of Gehenna. Anyway.
The next thing too that jumps out at me is and we don't have to agree on this, but I side with the scholars that date the Gospel of Matthew after the destruction of the temple and Rome's destruction of Jerusalem. And so the fact that Jesus is saying, go offer if you're offering a gift on the altar, and you realize that someone has something against you, go and make that right first. That language, there would be, I just think this passage, this little section, this little nugget, especially, though it might have some relevance to us today. I mean, I think some of us get really religious and forget to take care of our neighbor. But the fact this is included by Matthew's author after the temple was no more, I think speaks to the fact that this actually does go back. This section, at least we could say, goes back to the historical Jesus, that this is something that they kept in there, even though it is no longer applicable because he actually said it. I think that's cool. I mean, that's trivial, but I think it's cool.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And both that Matthew is written after the destruction and that this seems to ring true to what Jesus was saying. Absolutely. And,
it's just an older tradition.
Right. And I think, you look at this and this, you want to talk about, I mean, not just maybe a little bit of outdated advice for Jews post the destruction of Jerusalem, but this advice certainly seems a little bit archaic, as opposed to, obviously, none of us are involved in animal sacrifice now. None of us have that type of cultic tradition anymore. But I think if you get past the specific example and you look at how religion is so often guilty of doing this type of thing in principle, which is so obsessed about the cultic tradition, so obsessed about the order of worship, the high holy days, so obsessed about being faithful to God by being rigorous in the observance of the ceremonies and feast days and things like that. Our Christmases, our Easters, our day of worship, our chosen translation of the Bible, whatever it is. And we can obsess about those things and yet behave in horrible ways towards the people around us and think we're being faithful because of our rigorous faithfulness to rules and tradition at the expense of other people.
Yeah, I'm reminded. I love that. I love that. I'm reminded. What you just said made me think of, in the South. And again, the title of our show is Just Talking, and our hope is that we'll talk about the lectionary reading in the context of societal justice. I'm reminded of white Christians in the South that would be so observant in their church service on Sunday morning, and yet they would pause the church service to go to a lynching and then come back and continue on their service. I mean, what a huge disconnect.
That's exactly right. I think, I've seen so many examples of soldiers gathering together, and this is not to denigrate people who choose to give their lives in service of their country, but sometimes what happens in the context of military warfare is you can see people coming together and singing hymns of the faith and singing and getting right with God before they go off to engage in slaughter of other people. And you say, how do you align those things together? And somehow we've been able to say that being faithful to God in our worship solves the issue and or is what God requires, and this other thing is part of our society that has nothing to do with what God is asking us to do. And it seems like somehow we bifurcate, or we turn our violence into accomplishing God's will in some way, which is even scarier.
Yeah, I was just thinking of that. Your talking made me think of Christians' response to or their actions toward certain Christians, certain sectors of Christianity, are the way that we respond to the LGBTQ community. And I was thinking, yeah, what a disconnect that we can treat them with such bigotry and really do harm. But then it's more than just a disconnect. I think that example goes even further, and you just touched on it in principle, that it's not a disconnect for us. That many Christians think that fidelity to God requires them to treat their fellow human being if they're LGBTQ. Fidelity to God requires them to treat them that way, which is even worse than what we're talking about here. So, I mean, yeah, we're not sacrificing animals anymore, but dude, if you're going through your religious observance and you realize you've harmed someone, I love the fact that Jesus says, maybe it's time to, get up out of your pew and go. I'd rather you be there making that right than be here.
And this is in line with the prophets too. The prophets again and again talk about God saying, "I'm sick of your sacrifices. The smell of those burnt offerings make me nauseous. I don't want any part of that. Can you go take care of the widow? Can you take care of the orphan? Can you do justice?
Learn to do
mercy?"
justice. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And it's very much in line with the God of the prophetic tradition.
Absolutely. Yeah, the next section is settling matters quickly with your adversary who's taking you to court. I think that we're just in passing. Nothing there really speaks to me except for the fact that the court system you couldn't really depend on for justice back in the day.
And there's people today who can't depend on the court system either. I mean, if you can do things to help protect and solve issues. I mean, and maybe in this context, we would say not, you and I are the straight white
privileged
guys.
white guys.
And so in our position, would be more about where do we advocate for, bail reform? Where do we advocate for the legal representation reform, where anybody can actually get a lawyer when they need one, and things like that, where we're trying, and where we try to intervene in things before things get out of hand, because we know if they go to court, it very likely may not get a fair shake in the process. So it's where can we come alongside folks for you and me in our situation, that may be at least a little bit of lesson to
Yeah.
draw from.
Yeah. Court systems are still systemically unjust today, maybe in different ways, but still a concern.
And the people
I like
Jesus is
that, Todd.
talking to is back then, and Matthew is talking to, are people who are still on the margins. They're not the ones who are going to get the
That's
Roman
right.
Empire's best justice being done to them. They're the ones who
That's
are
right.
most likely to get harmed by it. So that way,
Yeah,
there is some alignment.
I'm reminded of how Howard Thurman in his book Jesus and the Disinherited, he talks about how Paul could claim, I'm a Roman citizen, I appeal to Caesar. But if Jesus was pushed down in a ditch, he wasn't a citizen, he was just a Jewish man in a ditch. And that's the audience, the social location of the audience here too, that this is being written to. So yeah, that interesting. I hadn't picked up on that, Todd. Thanks. That there's issues with the court system today too. I like that. The next thing that jumps out at me is the raw kind of ableist evaluation in the next part, where taking your right eye or cutting off your right hand, because it's better to have part of your body and not go into Gehenna than it's better than not. But there's this evaluation that how this passage defines wholeness is, well, let me say it this way: less whole is defined as less than, but better than nothing. And I don't have a corrective for that in the passage, but I want to be honest about the ableism that's in the passage. We can do better. We can do better, but I at least want to say, yeah, that's not cool. That part's not cool.
And sometimes the Gospels reflect where people are in time and place. This is not a book. The Scriptures are not the book where everybody always arises to the best. Sometimes they simply reflect, and even Jesus sometimes simply just reflects time and place and cultural understanding of things.
Right.
And perhaps this, for all we know, Herb, this is actually better than what people would typically say. I don't know. I mean, but the going into hell thing again is again, we're back to that as well. If you don't, better to lose an eye than go to hell. You still got that whole tradition coming in, and
it's so difficult to pull out of that if you were raised in it.
And if you're raised that you have to take all that stuff seriously as if it was inspired by God, God wanted that exact phrase put in there, it makes it hard to deal with that. And I think it's wise to say we got to remember the humanity of this book. We've got to remember the errors that still arise. And you've pointed out in other talks that I've heard you give about, we have to be careful of anti-Semitism and things like that. That's something that can come through in the passages as well. So, I mean, this is a very human book where people are wrestling with what God wants and how to follow God. And sometimes it still comes through a little bit messy.
Yeah, I love how James Cone said that theology will always tell us more about the theologian than it does about God. And this passage is one of those sections that tells us more about either the people it was written to or the people it was written by.
Right.
And to quote you, what you said earlier this week has just rolled over in my head when we were talking about this a little bit, that if this was Jesus, if Jesus actually did say this wasn't his finest moment. I love that. I love that. It's pretty ableist. Not cool.
Yeah. No, not at all.
And the next, do you have anything you want to talk about? There's the lust part of this verse as well. Not my favorite thing to talk about growing up in purity culture. I mean, I have a lot of baggage there.
Yeah. I that's the whole thing is I feel like I'm still, maybe not grasping what, or maybe I am, and it's just a struggle that I have with a passage, or maybe I don't understand the passage, is the term lust. I just, if it carries the weight that Jesus or Matthew interpreting or giving voice to a Jesus who says, pluck your eyeballs out. There's the lust must mean something stronger and more violent than maybe a kid looking at a Playboy magazine.
Sure.
I feel like that there's something more maybe stalkerish, you know, and that maybe it has the ones people who obsess and obsess on one person, and again on a specific person in your community, where you are making that person feel like a sex object and something that you want to consume with your desire, rather than a human being made in the image of God. That there's that you're actually doing that to another human being who is seeing that and sensing that. It seems like it's got to be something far beyond, because I think you're right with the whole purity culture. Man, we've done so much damage in the other way, just with boys and girls growing up and becoming sexual beings, and the interest and the curiosity in sex that comes from that. I mean, I think we're talking about apples and oranges. Or else this passage, in my opinion, would be a severe overreaction.
Sure.
So I don't know where you go with that.
Well, I like what you did with it, with the, you know, moving toward objectifying human beings or dehumanizing them. I like that. I think the fact that on the in the very next breath, the passage moves to divorce. I think speaks to what you're saying, as far as maybe giving some context for this, that this is divorce, not how it's practiced today, but again, how it was practiced back then. And Rome had some patriarchal parts to it in that culture. Not, you know, not all of Romanism was patriarchal, and there were pockets where women had equal rights and privileges, but divorce was often practiced in a way where in other cultures during this time, where in other Hellenized cultures, where women couldn't divorce their husbands, husbands could only divorce their wives, and they could do it for the most flippant of reasons. And maybe in that context, lust and adultery maybe begins to make sense. Like, you've made this commitment to this woman in this culture where her survival is dependent on being connected to you, and you're just flippantly moving on to another woman because it's a different flavor of the week. I don't know. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Maybe there's a context there. But even on this section of divorce, I think it's really, I come from a family of divorce. My parents have both been divorced multiple times. And so I've seen the social damage that divorce can do. And I know that divorce is horrible, but sometimes the marriages that people are getting out of are even worse. They're even more horrible. Right. And so I don't think this passage is talking about divorce the way that it's practiced in our society today.
Not at all.
I think what Jesus is talking about is, listen, you know, you can't divorce a woman for willy-nilly reasons when her economic survival is dependent on you. There's a justice component to this.
That's right.
And it's interesting. What gives me the hint there is that it says, if you do that, except for sexual immorality, if she's unfaithful, that's a different sub. And Matthew's the only one that makes that exception, by the way, as far as being in Mark doesn't give you that. But Matthew says, if she's been unfaithful, then you can divorce. The other gospels say no divorce, period. Again, in this context of patriarchal society.
Right.
But my whole point, the hint where I was trying to get to, and sorry, I got off track there, is it says that if you do this, you make her the victim of adultery, not her adultery. Right. You make her the victim of your adultery. You're the one lusting after someone else and wanting to get rid of her, and she's the victim here. And I think yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I
maybe
mean, you
that's a
can't say
context.
it's, yeah, you can't say it strongly enough. This is counsel commandment directed specifically and only to men, because in this context, in this culture, it was only men who really had, except in the case of, in this passage, of if the woman somehow got in, made an effort and of her own free will chose to go into adultery with somebody else. Otherwise, this is completely a man commandment saying you got to take care of a woman. Today, it's still not equal, but it's much more equal in the sense that if a man and a woman choose to divorce in this day and age, a woman has more at her disposal as far as how she can survive and move on her own. It's still there would be counsel about divorcing equitably, so that no one is really struggling, if you get divorced today. But in this context today, then that would be the counsel, I think, from Jesus. Matthew would be more to both men and women about how to do it best for the sake of the kids, if there's kids involved, and make sure economically things are done in a just way. But back then, it was very much Jesus was trying to protect women from what was happening way too much in the culture, where
And
men were taking advantage
yeah, and I
severely.
want to just emphasize, especially because there are some very vocal sectors of Christianity out there, um, that Jesus's concern in this passage when he speaks about divorce, his concern here, as I interpret it, is not primarily protecting the sanctity of marriage.
Correct.
His concern is the woman.
That's
His
right.
concern is the injustice that is going to be done to her in this already economically unjust patriarchy. The concern is the woman, not protecting an institution.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think the only thing left in this week's passage is the section on the vows. You got any wisdom on that, Todd? Again,
Not
I think it
really.
reflects the audience for which it was written. You know what I mean? That
Yeah.
we just don't do this kind of stuff anymore.
Yeah. I think it was much more common in that culture, to do that type of thing. And I think the general counsel about choosing to be honest in all things makes perfect sense.
Mm, mm.
But not, and again, honesty. I mean, wow, you want to talk about here's a profound thought. Write this down, Herb. Honesty is the best policy. It's just, as far as those of us living our lives for the sake of in in kindness and generosity and injustice to other people, we should not be people who are distrustful in our behaviors. In a society that too often has tricks people and pulls the rug out from under people, desperately, society needs more people who will stand by their word and can be trusted no matter what.
Yeah, just say what you mean and mean what you say.
Right.
I like it. I like it.
Yeah.
So my when I read passages like this week, again, it's a window for me into what, again, the early concerns of that community might have been, things that they were going through, concerns they had, struggle, things they valued. Um, but it makes me wonder what the Sermon on the Mount would look like if it were to be rewritten today, or if it was written today. What would it look like? I think it would still, what would remain is Jesus's concern for the concrete harms that people are experiencing in this life now. Um, it would still be concerned with injustice, like the section on divorce, or oppression, like the courts, or violence, as you brought out in the beginning. It would still be concerned with those things. But it does, and I don't have answers to that. It's just a thought
I
question for me. What would it look like if the Sermon on the Mount was written in our culture today?
Yeah, I would love to hear what Jesus would have to say on LGBTQ justice.
I would love
Uh,
that too.
I would love to hear what he would say about Black Lives Matter and
Me too.
And where would Jesus be down at the Mexican border with the immigrants, and as he was himself a refugee at one point, fleeing to Egypt, to be amongst those who are trying to find a better life, and what he would be saying to our government officials about our security policy and how we're behaving. It would be you could just imagine some of the powerful things that he would say in that context.
Yeah. To imagine. To imagine. Yeah. Whatever it was, something that helps me too is that this sermon was life-giving for its original audience.
That's right.
We need to interpret it in ways that are life-giving today. Maybe rewrite portions of it in ways that are life-giving today. But I think we also need to strive as Jesus followers for ways of following Jesus that are life-giving today. If it's not life-giving, then your interpretation needs to be challenged.
Absolutely.
Well, I got nothing left for this week, Todd. You got any last thoughts?
Right. I don't.
Anything
I think
we didn't cover that you said, I wanted to talk about that.
There's some brilliant stuff, I'm sure, that we totally just skipped right over and didn't see at all. And for that, we apologize, and we'll try to do better next time. But it's
when this passage rolls around in the lectionary 3 years from now, we'll
that's
do
right.
better.
We'll do better. Promise.
All right. Well, I want to thank everyone out there for watching, and hopefully you've been inspired by something we've said during this time to do more than just talking.
And remember that if you actually enjoyed this, and this is our first time at it, so we hope this even gets better even in the next couple of weeks. But if you enjoyed it and want to be reminded next time that when it's coming up the next week, hit that bell. Definitely hit the subscribe and like buttons. That's helpful to us and encouraging to us. And you can stay in touch with me on my website at toddjleonard.com.
And you can find me at renewedheartministries.com. And again, also, since this is on YouTube, if you see things that we could do better, leave a note there in the comments. Leave us a comment there and tell us what you liked about it, and tell us, hey, why don't you try this instead?
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you once again for watching. We'll see you next week. Thanks, Todd.
All right.